Bronwyn said, oh, go ahead. As Bronwyn said, I am Gene Scarpulla. I've been a member of the Maryland Ornithological Society for, I don't know, probably at least 35 years. And I'm also a member of the Maryland Entomological Society and editor of both journals for Maryland Birdlife as well as the Maryland Entomologist. So I'm going to teach you a little bit about shorebirds tonight. I would not be concerned about trying to take notes on every little thing that I say or everything that's on the screen. Since this is being recorded, you can always go back and watch the video again for the details. So I'll have a lot of information tonight, but it won't be everything. Now, we start with a little comic here. How do you want to drive really far? Or hey, do you want to drive really far and spend hours staring at distant, rapidly moving gray-brown objects while trying to find subtle differences between them? Of course not, no. What if they're bird-shaped? Then absolutely, yes. Yay, shorebird season, woo. And that's how I got started with shorebirds. They were distant little gray-brown objects that were hard to identify until I started studying them. And then they became much easier to do. So the bottom line is it's impossible for me to teach everything about shorebirds in 1 hour. It's also impossible to learn everything about shorebirds in 1 hour. But with this presentation, it may make you decide to study your field guides or get out in the field. And I can't say enough about getting out in the field and observing. That's how I learned shorebirds. So what the talk is, I'm going to talk about identifying the more common shorebirds, not rarities, but things that we would find normally here in Maryland. And we're going to look at the structure of the bird, the habitat that it occurs in, where it occurs, located in Maryland, what season is it in Maryland, and how to separate it from similar species. But what the talk is not, we're not going to talk about finding or identifying rarities. And there won't be a big emphasis on the different plumages, breeding, non-breeding, juvenile, and transitional. But some of that will come out because it is good for some of these species. So what are shorebirds? They're in the order Charadriiformes, and we have primarily 4 families that occur here in Maryland. The stilts and avocets, of which we have 2 species, 1 species of oyster catcher, the plovers, which primarily we have 5 species, and then the sandpipers, which are pretty much everything else falls into that category. So what are shorebirds? They do inhabit shorelines and shores, but also mudflats and grasslands. Several of these are grassland specialists. They generally feed on invertebrates, and they can run, walk, wade, and some of them even swim. And the plumage will vary throughout the year, and some have very characteristic vocalizations. And one thing that I have brought up with people who talk about shorebirds and they're unsure about them. Not everything at the shore is a shorebird, and not all shorebirds are at the shore. So what are not shorebirds? Waterfowl are not shorebirds. Any of the seabirds, they're not shorebirds. Any of the long-legged waders, herons, eorts, ibises, they're not shorebirds. And the rails, coots, gallinals, they are not shorebirds either. So how did I get started? Bombay Hook National Wildlife Refuge. In 1994, I went there every Saturday from May through October. So I got to see the species as they occurred. And when they were in breeding plumage in the spring, molting into non-breeding plumage during the fall, and then the juveniles as well, that generally August on through, some of the juveniles will come out, and they can look completely different plumage wise, but you'll see with the structure of the birds, they're the same as the adults. And where I learned more, I went to Hart-Miller Island almost every Saturday from May of 96 through December 2008, doing a weekly survey. It started out initially with shorebirds, but then it became all the birds, and then butterflies, and then dragonflies, and then moths and beetles and snakes, and everything, anything and everything that we could find out there was logged in for each trip. And how we're going to approach identification tonight, we're going to look at the structure of the birds, their behavior, which can be very, very characteristic, what habitat they occur in, and what age they are, the plumage. Because adults in particular, you'll see with short-billed dowitchers, the ages, the adults and the juveniles can look quite different, as well as the rest of these shorebird species. And then what season? Are they occurring in the spring or the fall? And often you have to use more than one field mark to make an identification. But don't let that frighten you away. So with structure, we look at the size of the bird. Is it very big? Is it small? Is it chunky? The body type and shape. Again, the bill shape. Is it long? Is it curved up? Is it curved down? Is it short? The head shape of the bird. The leg length. Does it have very long legs or very short legs? And the primary extension, which is the feathers on the tips of the wings, how far back they extend, either past, now I'll use a term here, but we'll get to it, how far past the tertials it goes, or how far past the tail it goes. And then also the posture of the birds. Some are very upright and some are very kind of horizontally oriented. So with behavior, again, the posture, it's affected by how the bird's body and the behavior of it shows the way the posture changes when the bird's feeding versus standing. Habitat is where the birds are hanging out. Feeding styles, some are probers in the mud. Some do scything, which is basically a back and forth motion, kind of like this, when they're feeding on the water surface. Some pick from the water surface. And then behavior, what they say, the calls and the vocalizations. Then with plumage, leg color can be important, although with yellow-legged type legs, they can be, if they're in the mud, they can be dark. So you can't always go by a dark-legged bird. Bill color, and we'll see examples of all of this. The overall general color tone of the bird itself, and the color of specific feather groups. And the topography, we'll show that in an upcoming slide, where the different feather groups are. And also any obvious field marks. And then the adults, during the spring season, April and May, they're molting into breeding plumage. So when they're first arriving, they may not be in full breeding plumage yet. They're still changing. They're in transitional plumage from the non-breeding plumage. And then once they're in breeding plumage, that can be very striking on some of the species. Then with fall migration, which starts in mid-July through November, the adults, they're worn. And there's a combination of what's left of the breeding plumage and it's going into the winter plumage. And I'll mention here also that the spring migration is generally 2 months, April and primarily May. Whereas the fall migration, it starts mid-July and runs through November. So it's very protracted in the spring and much longer in the fall. The juveniles, the fall migration, these can be really pretty. Brand new feathers all come in at the same time, and a lot of them have this bright feather edging on them that gives it this scaliness appearance. And the feathers all basically look the same. You don't find old feathers and new feathers. These are all new feathers, and they can be very striking looking. So things that we'll talk about today, we'll talk about the eye line that goes actually through the eye. Here it's a dark one. The supercilium, which goes above the eye. Here it's white. The crown of the birds. We don't need to get into all of this. The tertials are back here. This is important when we get to the dowitchers and the primary projection, how far it sticks out either past the tertials or past the tail, if it does stick out past the tail. Then the undertail coverts are under here, and the vent is under here. The other important things, we'll look at the breast and the belly and what type of coloration is there from the feathering. And then when birds are in flight, the primary feathers are the ones at the ends of the wings. These are the primaries here. Well, here, it's spread out more down here. And then the secondaries back here, right in here. The axillaries, I'll mention the axillaries. These are the what I'll call the armpits, and these are important for identifying the plovers. And you'll see that coming up as well. So in flight, you look at the rump, the upper tail coverts, the axillaries for the plovers. Are there wing stripes on the bird? The back, the tail, and leg extension. How far back the legs extend. So I'll mention this is year 5 of the Breeding Bird Atlas. We have 8 species that nest in Maryland. Black-necked stilt, American oystercatcher, killdeer are pretty much everywhere. Piping plovers on the eastern shore, upland sandpipers in Garrett County, American woodcock throughout Maryland, spotted sandpipers are pretty much throughout, and willets. But there are 2. Wilson's plover used to breed down in Assateague. They haven't bred for many years. And Wilson snipe is a probable breeder, but they have yet to be confirmed. There are, during this current Atlas period, there's 3 records of them out in Cherry Creek Glades out in the McHenry area of Garrett County. But just the fact that they're there does not necessarily mean they're breeding. So if any of you are really want to go out and spend time walking around the marshes out there in Garrett County, you could win a prize for finding Wilson snipe breeding. So let's go through the 4 families. The Recurvorostridae are the stilt and avocet family, and that word translated means bent back bill. And we have 2 species, and these are unmistakable: black-necked stilt and American avocet. And again, you don't have to read everything that's up there. The most important things I have highlighted and with asterisks. Black-necked stilts have a black neck. Whether they're in breeding plumage or in winter plumage or juveniles, they have a dark neck always back here. And they're very vocal, always doing this yip, 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 yip sound. And they do breed on the lower eastern shore. That's the best place to go see them. Whereas American avocets, they do not have a dark black neck in any plumage, but they do have a white wing patch that's seen in every plumage. So those 2 characteristics can easily separate black-necked stilt and American avocet. And avocets are here as migrants, whereas the black-necked stilts are breeders. In the oystercatcher family, we have 1 species, and the Hematopodidae means blood red foot. Now, I would kind of disagree. I'd say the bill and the eye are much brighter than the legs are and their feet. But this is what they're called anyway. But look at the large, thick, bright red orange bill. in flight or standing, it's unmistakable, the bills on these birds, as well as the bright red orbital ring, which surrounds the eye. Those two characteristics will jump at you. And this is a Maryland breeder, generally in coastal areas, lower eastern shores, where you'd want to go for these. Then we have the lapwings and plover family, and primarily 5 species of plovers. And the Charadriidae, that comes from the word plover in Greek, which came from the word for gully, which was where they were thought to breed. So we have 3 different groups of the plovers. Ones with double breast bands, killdeer, and ones with single breast bands, semi-palmated and piping, and then the ones with no breast bands, black-bellied and American golden. So this is another unmistakable one, the double-banded plovers. Killdeer has 2 breast bands, except when they're little juveniles that have hatched out. They only have 1 then. But generally, I think you can see that this is not an adult bird. This is just a young fledgling, still with its downy feathers. And they are very vociferous. They're always calling, killdeer, 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 especially if you're anywhere near, they might have a nest. And they do a broken wing distraction display for you to distract you away from the nest, and hopefully a predator would go after the adult, who again, at that point, could just fly away. These are common Maryland breeders, permanent residents throughout the state, and found in all counties. Then the single-banded. There are 2 to choose from here. Semi-palmated plover and piping plover. Same size, but look at the coloration on these. The semi-palmated has a brownish back and head. Piping plover is pale gray back and head. So why is this so? Look at the habitat they occur on. They occur on mudflats, and they blend in with the mudflat, whereas piping plovers occur on ocean beaches, and they blend in with the beaches. Piping plovers, you want to go primarily down to Worcester County, Assateague Island to see those. They do nest there. Now, semi-palmateds are only here for migration. Well, I should say primarily spring and fall migrants. They technically could occur other times of the year, but generally it's spring and fall migration. And then we have the 2 unbanded plovers, black-bellied and American golden. And the way to look at these, the black-bellied is bigger, it's chunkier, it has a large round head as opposed to a small kind of flattened head on the golden plover. It has a much larger, thicker bill versus a thinner bill in the golden plover. Also, the size of the neck is thicker versus the thin bill. And the primaries up here are fairly short. They don't go very far past the tail, whereas here they do extend past the tail. Blackbellies are a migrant, spring and fall, but the golden plovers primarily are a fall migrant. So you'd want to look for them towards the end of August and into September. So the difference, and I'll mention plumages here. When they're in breeding plumage, black-bellied has a white vent down here, whereas goldens are black in the vent. Black-bellies have a white crown versus a dark crown on golden plovers. And you'll notice the overall coloration is black and white on a black-bellied plover, where it has a golden tinge on the golden plovers. And what do they look like in non-breeding plumage? Well, yeah, they do look a little similar, but again, look at the size of the body. They're chunkier in the black belly. It has that larger rounded head. It has a larger bill, has a thicker neck and shorter primaries. And these two characteristics, if they're side by side, you can really pick these out. And once you get used to the general characteristic of a species, it doesn't matter what plumage it's in, you can pick out these general characters for them. And then this is where I talked about the black armpits, the axillaries. When they're flying, it doesn't matter whether they're in breeding plumage or non-breeding plumage. The whoop, what happened there? The axillaries are black in all plumages for black-bellied plovers, whereas golden plovers, they're pale, the armpits. They do have a darker rump, which you can see here, versus the white rump up here for the black bellies. And they have a wider, thicker wing stripe. It's less apparent in the golden plover. But the main thing is the armpits, black versus pale. And then the sandpiper family. There are tons of sandpipers. And the word Scarpulla came from woodcock, which came from long-pointed stick. And that's the shape of the bills. So I have these broken down into different groups. We have 7 that are in the larger sandpiper category. The 2 godwits, which are unmistakable when you look at the size of the bills on godwits, extremely long bills. And the marbled's a little bit bigger than the Hudsonian. Both bills are bicolored and slightly recurved, which means they curve up a very little bit. But the main characteristics, grayish back on Hudsonian, and in breeding plumage, the underparts are reddish, which you can't see on this slide. And I'll mention with bird photography, one photograph cannot show all the characteristics for every bird. You really need photographs from a lot of different angles. But that and the wing linings on the undersides of the wings are black. And these both are migrants. But over here, they have a generally tawny color overall for marbled godwits. And the wing linings are cinnamon versus black. So both of these are around spring and fall migration. Then we have another unmistakable, whimbrel. This is a fairly large, erect bird, stands very upright, and it has a long decurved bill, you can see here, and a brown striped head. You'll see these stripes going back and forth across the top of the head. And these are migrants, spring and fall. Primarily, I should say. All of these things, you can take everything. There are exceptions to everything, but these are primarily the cases that I'm talking about. Now, upland sandpiper, these are another bird that's very erect, but look at the long, thin neck. These necks look way too thin for a bird this size and way too long. And it's got a very small head on top of this small neck, but a very big eye. That large dark eye just stands out against the small head and the thin neck. And these are primarily a fall migrant, but they do breed in Garrett County, and formerly they bred in more counties along the northern border of Maryland, the northern border counties, including definitely Cecil County. And then the long-legged waders, we have 3 species, willet, greater yellowlegs, and lesser yellowlegs. Willet and greater are kind of closer in size, but greater yellowlegs is much slimmer than willet. And I mentioned here, there are 2 subspecies currently of willet, which eventually one day may be split. These breeding eastern willets are very kind of brownish, and they have lots of coloration on them in breeding plumage on the chest, whereas western willets are a little paler, not as deeply speckled on their breast. And I'll show you more shots of these. Now with eastern willet, they have a long, thick bill, and you can see how thick these bills are, no matter whether it's breeding, non-breeding, or juveniles. Dark brown, heavily barred underneath, black and white wing pattern. If they're in flight, this is unmistakable. And they're also very willet. Oh yeah, very vocal, saying pill will willet if you're anywhere near where they're nesting. These are breeders in Maryland's coastal marshes. So if you get on the eastern shore, you'll find lots of these, especially like places around Assateague, any of those islands back in the marshes. Very common breeder. So, but it becomes, if you want to try and separate these, there are some characteristics. Generally, the western willet is larger, has a longer, thinner bill versus the thicker, shorter bill, and longer legs versus the shorter legs. And the western willets are here during spring and fall migration, whereas eastern willets, they're here during the migrations, but they're also the summer breeder in the coastal marshes. Now, greater yellow legs and lesser yellow legs. Everyone has problems with these, including me sometimes. They're easy when they're standing side by side. They're so different in size, shape, and their bills. But how often are they side by side? Often they're single birds. So you got to look at some characteristics. And with greater yellow legs, look at this longer, thin, usually bicolored bill, paler at the base, darker towards the tip, and it can be slightly upturned in greater yellow legs. And you can just barely see it upturned here, this bicolored bill. And these are primarily a migratory species, spring and fall coming through. Now, comparing that to lesser yellow legs, a shorter, thinner bill. You can see this is very thin, these bills, and dark. Generally, it's dark all the way from tip to base. And again, this is another migrant. So comparing them structure-wise, lesser yellow legs is smaller at 10.5 versus 14. It has a slimmer body than greater. The bill length is 1.5 times the head depth for greater yellow legs, and I'll show you in the next slide how these two differences are, versus the bill length being the same as the head depth for lesser yellow legs. Bill is often slightly upturned in greater, versus lesser, it's shorter, thinner, daintier. Bill usually pale at the base in greater and all black in lessers. So showing that. When I talked about the bill length here for a greater yellow legs is about 1.5 times the head depth, which is this measurement here. Now, if you look at the lesser yellow legs, the bill length and the head depth are about the same. And sometimes this can be a little hard to see out in the field on a single bird, but this is a good difference. As you can tell, the bill is much bigger. And right here, you'll see a little kink where it's slightly upturned on the greater yellow legs. And their behavior. Greater yellow legs, when they feed, are very active and they dart around, very frenetic, picking at things floating on the surface and also things that are under the water. Their call, they give their two notes. It's usually 3 or 4 two notes, whereas lesser yellow legs, their call is 1 or 2 two notes. So you can be standing in the middle of the forest and one of these birds comes over, you can tell whether it's greater or lesser, depending on the number of two notes it gives. Lesser yellow legs are not a very active feeder, and they feed by picking at things, on the surface or by scything through the water, just putting their bill back and forth, picking at things that are in the water. But yellowlegs are kind of comical when they're darting around like they're high on something. Then the mid-sized sandpipers, and there's a lot of them here, but they're broken down into groups. We'll start with the very inland sandpipers, Wilson snipe and American woodcock. They're similar in size. Both have long bills. And I'll mention here this prehensile bill that the woodcock has is when it probes underground, it finds worms and can grab the worm and pull it on up. So looking at the heads, they have a striped head on Wilson snipe, whereas it's a barred head and nape on woodcock. Barred flanks here versus buff colored underparts, which you can't see completely on this specimen. Large, high set eyes. They're really high up on the head on woodcocks. Sniper migrants, probably a Garrett County breeder, but again, at this point, unconfirmed. And woodcocks breed throughout Maryland. Then the shorter leg probers. These three can give people a problem. They're all migrants, and they all feed in a sewing machine fashion. But how they do this, that can tell you what you're looking at. So with the short-billed dow, it has a long, kinked bill. This kinks downward, versus with long-billed, it's long and straight. But you can't always go by the length of a bill because males and females have different length bills, and the males of one species versus the females of another species can overlap. So you can't always go by that. And then stilt sandpiper, it has a shorter decurved bill, slightly decurved, and longer legs than you'll find on dowitchers. And this is important, as you will see. Here's a close-up of the bills, long and kinked right here versus straight on long-billed. And then stilt sandpiper with its decurved down here, slightly decurved, and a shorter bill than both of these other two species. So we know that dowitchers have a longer bill and shorter legs. It's just the opposite in stilt sandpipers. They have longer legs and the shorter decurved bill. So why is this important? When they're feeding in their sewing machine fashion, with the dowitcher, it has short legs and a long bill. So when it feeds, it's horizontal because of the long bill. It can reach the mud. Stilt sandpipers, they have a short bill but long legs, so they have to tip, and the tail end tips up when they're feeding. So those two things can tell you the difference between dowitchers versus a stilt sandpiper on how they're feeding. Now, this characteristic, I don't find it greatly usable for me, but I'll put it out there. Short bills, they say, have the flatter back versus a rounded back. And this is kind of showing extremes, excuse me, here. With the hump at the shoulder on short-billed dowitchers, where it tends to be more in the center of the back for long-billed dowitchers. But again, I have difficulty with that one. And the juveniles are so pretty when they come out. Short-billed dowitchers are an early fall migrant, and the way to tell the difference between the juvenile short-billed dowitchers versus long-billed dowitchers, you look at these feathers back here, the tertials, and they all have internal markings, whereas the tertials back here do not have internal markings. They're plain. Short-bills come early in the fall migration. You'll find them in August, but long-billed archers, they come later. And these are the ones that will be around in the fall and the winter time. So if you have them on a Christmas count, the odds are you've got long-billed dowitchers. And you can just barely see the dull feather edging on these birds. It's very faint. Even in the field, it's faint to be able to see it. But they are there, and I mean, it's easy to separate the two as far as when they're juveniles. Oh, and I should mention, once you get into adults, longbills and shortbills all have these internal markings on the tertials. So this only applies to the juveniles of the two species. Then we have 5 species that occur on the Atlantic coast. And these are mid-sized, and all 5 are migrants. Red knot, they are chunky, short legs and a tubular tapered bill. It's very tubular, almost like a soda straw. Where do they occur? Where horseshoe crabs are mating. The Delaware Bay beaches are great places if you want to see red knots. Tidal mudflats, they're wonderful areas. And primarily red knots are a spring migrant. And this shows you the plumage, breeding versus non-breeding versus juvenile. And the general shape of the bird and the bill are the same, no matter when. And the best time during that spring migration is mid to late May, when the horseshoe crabs are around, to look for red knots. Then ruddy turnstones. These, an excellent place to look for these in migration and in the wintertime is down at the Ocean City Inlet. One thing you notice, whether it's a breeding adult, a non-breeding adult, or the juvenile, they have this upside down question mark on the chest and the neck. They occur on rock jetties around the Ocean City Inlet. Is a great place to see them here in migration and definitely in the winter time down on the jetties. Purple sandpiper. This is another one that's primarily a winter bird. You can get them in migration, but primarily winter. They have bright orange legs. They have a long, thin, slightly decurved bill that's orange at the base. Excuse me, I'm choking here. Okay. And habitat, rock jetties, Ocean City Inlet. Best place, excuse me. Best place to look for them, Ocean City Inlet in the winter. Dunlin. They have this long black bill, decurved at the tip. You can find these in migration and in winter. Go anywhere where there's salt and freshwater marshes, tidal mudflats, and sandy beaches. Bombay Hook, you can find tons of these during season. And they're striking in breeding plumage with this black belly patch. But if you look at the shape of all 3 birds, it's the same, whether they're breeding or non-breeding. Sanderlings. Sanderlings, when they come through in the springtime, they're in transitional plumage. As they're migrating through, they don't reach full breeding plumage until they get to their breeding grounds up north in Canada. So occasionally you'll see one in breeding plumage in the springtime, and they are striking. They're really beautiful. But usually it's in some type of transition like this bird up here. Non-breeding, they're very gray. But one thing to look at, and they are the palest sandpiper in winter. Look at the black. Someone just brought me a glass of water. Thank you. And notice the black at the bend of the wing. This is in all plumages, non-breeding, juveniles, and it's harder to see when they're in breeding plumage, but they always have this black at the bend of the wing. And this will come up later on in the presentation. Habitat, you can see these on all the ocean beaches. They're running in and out with the surf. And look for them during migration and especially in wintertime. Then the other mid-sized, we have 4 species. Spotted sandpiper, which is a Maryland breeder, and they always bob their tail up and down. Very characteristic of these birds. And when they're flying, they have very distinctive stiff wing beats. In breeding plumage, they're unmistakable with these spotted underparts. But in both either breeding or non-breeding, they always have this little white patch here in breeding and non-breeding plumage. And you'll notice the black stripe through the eye and the white supercilium above the eye. These are all characteristics for spotted sandpipers. But breeding plumage ones, they're distinctive. And they do breed various places in Maryland. Solitary sandpiper looks a little bit like a yellow legs, but it has a bold white eye ring in all plumages. And heavily streaked breasts when they're in breeding plumage, and this long, thin, straight bill. They're around during migration. You can find them in pretty much any marsh habitat, reservoirs, pond edges, any place where there's a water edge, you can find these. Pectoral sandpipers, they're kind of fairly easy to pick out. They have these very heavily streaked breasts. The adults and the juveniles all have heavily streaked breasts. Straight, tapered, bicolored bill. So pale towards the base, darker towards the tip. Long wings. Primary extension extends quite a way back. And again, anywhere where there's water, you can find these primarily during spring and fall migration. Buff-breasted, these are a fall migrant. So you want to look for these towards the end of August into, well, September, late August into September. They're kind of chunky, but they're very buffy colored, hence the name. But you can see this when you see them in the field, they are very buffy colored and they have a very prominent black eye. Stands out against the buffy color. These you can find in plow fields, turf farms, places like that. And again, fall migration is when you would want to look for these. And then 2 species that don't call them peep. Some people do. White rump sandpiper. Okay, this is a migrant, as is the other one that we will discuss, the buff. Yeah, no, wait a minute. The Baird sandpiper. Both are migrants. The wings extend beyond the tail in both species. The white rump can be seen in flight for white rumps. But the way to pick them out when they're in breeding plumage, they have these little chevrons along the flanks, and they have this pinstriping on the breast. It reminds me of New York Yankees uniforms with the pinstriping. And rufous on the crown and the shoulders, here and here. Doesn't show up real well in the photo. Non-breeding, they're very gray, but they do have that white supercilium going through. And again, look for the longer tail. Not tail, I'm sorry, longer wings that are extending beyond the tail. Baird's is similar in shape, but does not have the white rump in flight. The wings do extend beyond the tail. These are primarily a fall migrant. It's unusual to see one here in the spring in Maryland. And usually these are juveniles that are seen in the fall. And this white feather edging gives the back a very scaly appearance. When they do occur as an adult, again, very rare. They're very brownish and they don't have those feather edgings because that's only with the juveniles. And then the three smallers. These are the actual peep. They're all migrants, but some least and westerns do occur in the wintertime. But semi-palmated do not occur in the wintertime. So doing Christmas counts, least and westerns are the two that you can potentially find on Maryland Christmas counts. Least sandpaper, least, yes, least sandpiper has this tapered, pointed, slightly decurved bill and yellow legs. Again, if they're mud covered, you won't see the yellow legs. And they're very brownish of the three peeps. These are the most brownish in all plumages. Semi-palmated is grayer of the three species. And it has a short bill, tubular like a soda straw, longer in females versus males. And Western sandpiper has a long bill that's tapered and slightly decurved and drooped occasionally at the end. You'll see this big droop. And the black legs in both of these species, and they tend to, in breeding plumage, you'll notice these chestnut highlights on the head and on the wings, on the upper parts here. Least sandpiper, and we'll talk about each one quickly. This tapered bill, pointed, slightly decurved. Look for the yellow legs, and always the darkest brown of the three peeps. Semi-palmated, short, usually tubular, blunt-tipped bill. It doesn't go to a point. It's blunt-tipped. And I mentioned that the females can have longer bills in the eastern populations. Black legs, and these are much grayer looking than the brown least sandpipers. And then Western sandpipers, much longer bills, and they tend to droop towards the end. And one thing to me, where the bill and the head meet tends to be more straighter on Western sandpipers to me than it does on the semi-palmated sandpipers. And compared side by side, and these all show a Western and a semi-palmated, but look at the shapes of the bills, long, decurved versus short, tubular, kind of a stocky neck, but hard to tell in this photo. Look at the chevrons on the chest and going down the flanks, and a little chunkier body. But look at the bill comparison on these two birds, the Western out front and the semi-palmated in the back. And the same here, this Western long bill versus the semi-palmated that's tubular and blunt. And lastly, we have the spinning swimmers, the three phalaropes. One of them occurs inland, Wilson's phalaropes, whereas the other two are primarily pelagic. They are occasionally found inland, but these are primarily out on the Atlantic Ocean. Usually observed while they're floating, and they spin around in circles when they're feeding. And again, these are during migration that they're coming through, but rednecks and reds would be much more common on a fall, winter, spring pelagic trip. Now, with these species, the females are brighter than the males. They've reversed roles. So what happens, the females and the males mate. The female lays her eggs, and the male is the one that incubates them. She runs off, goes and mates with another male, lays another clutch of eggs, runs off. He incubates those. So she's the more brightly colored, whereas the males are much less brightly colored. Now this one's a non-breeding male, but they're much less, a breeding male would be much less colorful than this. And way to tell this from the other phalaropes, they have a very long, thin black bill. And they're more likely to be seen inland anywhere. Then red-necked, this is a pelagic, and generally they're out on the ocean all year except for when they're on the breeding ground. And the way to tell the difference in these, they always have stripes on their back, whether they're in breeding or non-breeding plumage. And you'll see a black eye patch here in their non-breeding type plumage. The bill is shorter if you compare it. Look how long this is versus how short this is. It's a little shorter. It's thin, a little thicker at the base for rednecks. But rednecks and red, those are the ones that you have to separate out on the ocean. And generally the birds you're seeing are not in breeding plumage. They're in their non-breeding plumage. So this would be typical for a red phalarope in non-breeding plumage, whereas the females are kind of striking when they're in breeding plumage. And notice the bright yellow bills become black during the non-breeding season. But the way to tell these from the red-necked phalaropes, they have no stripes on their back when you see them on the ocean. Now, on the breeding grounds, that's a little different here. But on the ocean, non-breeding plumage, they don't have stripes on their backs. And they have a shorter, thicker bill. You can see in this shot how thick that is. And they do have a dark patch behind the eye in their non-breeding plumage, and a pale gray back versus striped back. So with that, that covers our 8 species that nest here. Some of you are going to go out and try and document Wilson snipe breeding out in Garrett County, I'm sure. And then here's the quiz. What's wrong with this comic? How to be a peep. Probe for food. Pause for a tiny scream. And okay. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and say, what is wrong with this? Then you learned something tonight. I'll give you a hint.
Yeah, give us a hint. I don't. Give me a hint.
Look at the black shoulders. The black shoulders. That's diagnostic for a sanderling, which is not one of the peep. So I'll give you some shorebird references. If you're just going to look at general field guides, the two I would recommend are the National Geographic Field Guide. That's the one that I use the most, and then also the Sibley Guide to Birds, which I have at home, but this is the one I carry in the field. And then if you really get into shorebirds, then there's a few references. These are the two that I started with because nothing else existed back in the day. Shorebirds Identification Guide is very good. And then this one I was unsure of, Shorebirds of the Pacific Northwest, but it has excellent graphics in there showing the differences between many of the species that we have here in Maryland. So I do recommend those two. The other three, I've got these as backups at home. These came after I was doing all my shorebirding. But Shorebirds of North America from Dennis Paulson, and then Shorebirds of North America, Europe, and Asia in the center. And then this is the one by Shorebird Guide by Michael O'Brien, Richard Crosley, and Kevin Carlson. And Michael, as many of you know, was from Montgomery County here in Maryland. My acknowledgements. I can't thank Bill Hubick and Jim Stass enough for allowing me to use the photographs that they had. Both excellent birders, have been birding here in Maryland for a long while. And unfortunately, we lost Bill Hubick out to California, but he still keeps in touch and is heavily involved, one of the founders of the Maryland Biodiversity Project. And supplementary photos I got from this Shorebird ID Challenges and Identification Workshop that 3 MOS members put together in 2007 for, I believe it was an in-person workshop. And a lot of the photographers that are listed here, they allowed their photos to be used for this workshop. And then special acknowledgement to my wife, Marcia Watson, for twisting my arm to create this presentation. And eventually I got it ready to go. And now she's twisting my arm to do one on gulls, Gulls 101. So maybe for next year. And hopefully the presentation has left you with insight into identifying shorebirds and not left your mind spinning like a fallow rope. And with that, I guess I can stop sharing. And if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, that was wonderful, Jean. Let me put a spotlight on you, and then we can start going through some questions. So, wow. All right, let's see. First of all, what is the prize if somebody finds the Wilson snipe in breeding?
If you can document breeding, I will have a shorebird mug that I will give you.
Okay, there you go. All right. All right, Justine, we answered that question. He's working on the gull one, so that's great. Joyce asked, what do you mean by the word peep? Not heard that reference previously.
Generally, that term's been thrown around for these small sandpipers, least semi-palmated western, and most people threw in the other two, white-rumped and the Bairds. But white-rump and Bairds are bigger, so they're not considered in peep. Now, the origin of the word peep, I'm not sure. I don't know if it came from Great Britain, but they do mention peeps, I know, in Europe. So that may have been where that term came from, but I can't say for certain.
Well,
and if you want to unmute, you can just raise your hand, and I can call on you if you want to ask a question directly to Jean. We can do it.
How do I raise my hand?
Okay,
well,
go ahead.
Hear you.
There was the one bird that could be found wherever horseshoe crabs are mating.
Yep.
Why is that? Do they eat the eggs or
That's
something?
what they eat on their way north, heading to their breeding grounds up in the Arctic. They're chowing down primarily in Delaware Bay and New Jersey shore of the Delaware Bay. They're eating horseshoe crabs, and that's what they load up on. They bulk up, and that gives them the energy then to fly up to the Arctic and lay their eggs.
Huh.
Yep.
Marcia asked.
Oh, I was just going to say, I haven't been to the shore the last few years, but going back 20 years ago, I know horseshoe crabs were everywhere in the springtime. I'm not sure how numerous they are now versus then. I know Miss Billy and Light, you can still get shorebirds down there. And Shireen, if you want to chime in, I know for a while you were doing, I believe you were doing horseshoe crab surveys, if that's correct. Or if anyone else is aware of how horseshoe crabs are doing now versus 20 years ago.
It was a long time ago. I haven't been doing it. Sorry.
Okay. Well, you can start next week
Well, we have and we have a trip over there to see the horseshoe crabs, and I'm just trying to look it up to see where
Mm.
what date it is, and I can't. It's not coming up.
It's
But
June 6th, June
June
4th
6th,
and
okay.
June 6th, but it's actually full.
Oh, there you go. Thank you. Thank you.
So
It's
I'll
full.
just say there's a lot of pressures on horseshoe crabs over the last couple of decades. They're fish to use for bait in crab traps and lobster traps and other kind of fisheries. They're also used in the biomedical industry. Their blood is useful in several different biomedical procedures. And then there are other pressures on them. So horseshoe crabs were really being overfished in the Delaware Bay and the Chesapeake Bay. And it had an effect, a noticeable effect on red knots because they're so dependent on the horseshoe crabs. So Delaware and Maryland and Virginia and New Jersey have all put in some horseshoe crab regulations, but there's still room for improvement. But, you know, when I used to go down to Port Mahon on the Delaware Bayshore, you'd see guys with, this is before the restrictions were put in place, you'd see guys backed up, they'd back up their pickup trucks to the shoreline and just be hauling horseshoe crabs out and filling up the back bed of the pickup truck. They'd drive away, dump them, and come back for more. I mean, it was just an ongoing thing during the time when the horseshoe crabs were laying their eggs. So the red knots really suffered.
And Marcia, the horseshoe crabs that they use for the hemophiliac medicines, they bleed them, but they re-release them. So they take some of the blood. They don't kill them.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of different biomedical uses. That's not the only one. Mm-hmm.
All right, Mackenzie, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, I just had two questions, but first of all, thank you for the amazing presentation. I'm new to birding and I was wondering what type of equipment or like spotting scope versus binoculars do you like recommend to view shorebirds? And then how does one get involved in field work? Do you have any organizations you recommend to reach out to? Anything like that would be great. And thanks in advance.
Well, let's see, where do I start? Yeah, a decent pair of binoculars. For shorebirds, if they're close, binoculars are good, but often with shorebirds, they're far away. Depending on how much money you want to spend, you can get decent optics without spending a ton of money, or you can get exceptional optics and spend a lot of money. So it kind of depends on how much money you want to spend. For brands, I mean, the top end brands, you're looking at things like Leica, Swarovski, Nikon, things like that. But you can get cheaper brands or not the high end of those particular brands, but more modest, I'd say, of those particular brands. But for shorebirds, and I'll say for gulls as well, a good spotting scope is what you need. When I first started going to Hart-Miller, I'll give you two quick anecdotes. When I first went there, my very first trip, where I knew very little about shorebirds at all, and I was with a lot of the big name birders, I'll say, back in the day. This would be in the late 80s, early 90s. And I was just overwhelmed. The people that were out there, they're identifying things in flight. Well, it's a mile away flying and calling, and they're identifying it. Or it's a mile away on the mudflat, and they're identifying it. And I'm thinking, wow, am I out of my league here? With all of this going on. But then, once I started studying shorebirds and going through all the plumages and the calls and the things, I became much more proficient at this, so that when I was doing Hart-Miller Island every weekend, one time I was out with two of my friends who, again, were very experienced birders, much more than I was. And they're having this discussion about this three birds that are about a mile away on the other side of the dike. And well, I think it's this. No, I don't think so. I think it's this. Well, yeah, but look at this. Yeah, well, what about that? And I'm looking at it through my scope and I said, well, why isn't it three red knots that are in non-breeding plumage? And they just said, eh. So we ended up, you walk around Hart-Miller Island, we got to the other side of the dike, and there were three red knots in non-breeding plumage. So I figured, I guess I have learned something. So it's just a matter of practice. But yeah, it really does help to have a scope when you're dealing with shorebirds. And I think I was going to say something else about shorebirds, and I got distracted here telling my other anecdote.
Jean, the second part of the question was, how do you get involved in any research going on? Or
Wow. That's a good question. And I'm not real sure who is doing this type of research anymore. You can check with, if U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I know they do get summer interns for some jobs. It may not necessarily be shorebirds, but it could be terns, it could be shorebirds, gulls, it could be any sorts of things where they will get interns to go out and help, like on places like Poplar Island, doing surveys out there. In Maryland, I'm not sure of people that are organizations that are doing surveys right now. Marcia, you have any clue on this?
The Delaware people, the analog of DNR in Delaware, whatever they call their Natural Resources Division, they have an organized shorebird survey that they do every summer. And on their webpage, there's a link to how to get in touch with them if you want to volunteer for that.
Jean, can I chime in, please?
Sure.
I just wanted to mention, in terms of volunteering for shorebird field work, the Manomet Bird Observatory has the International Shorebird Survey Program, where you can pick out a site and do regular surveys during the migration periods. They're based in, I think, Cape Cod. The other thing is just going out on your own in the field and looking for banded birds during the spring and taking down the ID and reporting those birds to the Banded Bird Lab is also a great way to contribute.
thanks,
Thank
Shireen.
you so much.
If anybody has those links and you just want to plop them into the chat box for Mackenzie to grab, or anybody else to grab, that would be great if you had that right now. That kind of builds Mackenzie's question about what type of tools to use, builds on Marcia's question is, what happens when you go out and you have a whole flock of mixed species and thousands of shorebirds, and what strategies would you suggest to working through a large group like that?
Okay, well, that happened many places. Hart-Miller Island, back when Hart-Miller Island was really in its prime, and you could have 10,000 shorebirds out there in a day. And if you have a large flock, the best thing to do is kind of scan through the entire flock and get a feel of how many might be, again, if you're dealing with peep, how many are Western versus least versus semi-palmated, how many are plovers, and just in rough percentages, because all you need is a peregrine to fly through and everything scatters. So you want to kind of get a general feel as to if you think, well, if you go through and count by hundreds, or in some cases 500s, or in some cases thousands at a time, and you go 1,000 versus 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, and work your way through the flock to give you an idea of how many birds there are, and then try to break that up percentage-wise as to how many are various groups, plovers versus sandpipers versus whatever, dowitchers. And then if you still have time and the birds have not flown away, that's when you can get into scanning through and looking for other things that are in there that are all mixed in that you may have missed initially. So that's kind of the way to do it. The most I had ever seen at one time was over on the eastern shore of Delaware Bayshore, what was, when it used to be open to the public, the Ted Harvey Conservation Area. And for free, it used to be free. Now you have to get a permit, an out-of-state permit to go there. But anyway, when the one time I was there, and it was right around dusk, and shorebirds were coming in. It was more than you could, you couldn't identify them. They were in the distance, but I estimated 750,000 birds came in at dusk. It was just a steady stream that you just had to do 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000 as they were coming in. But yeah, some days are like that, but I've only had one day that was like that.
All right, let's see. Any other questions? You can raise your hand. I can call on you. Oh, let's see. Okay, Jillian, do you recommend any cameras for viewing or ID of birds? I'm thinking that some of the zoom lenses out there, like a Nikon Coolpix P950 would be useful.
You're asking the wrong person. I do no bird photography.
Are there any photographers on the call who might want to answer, Jillian?
I use a Nikon 400mm lens with a 1.4 tele converter on it. So that's a effective focal length of 560mm. The other thing you can do is if you have a scope, you can buy adapters to attach your iPhone to the scope and take photos through that as well.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I just have a simple little Nikon, and that's when I always take photos of the, thousands of birds so I can later zoom in and actually scan to see what exact birds I saw, because I do the Delaware Bay horseshoe crab and shorebird trip every May over there at DuPont Nature Center. It's a great day trip, people. So if you can't come out to the Baltimore Bird Club one on the 25th of May and you can't make it to the Natural History Society on the 6th, go. It's amazing. Go to DuPont Nature Center. It's all about shorebirds and horseshoe crabs. They have live feeds, live cameras, scopes. Millions of people are on the all around with their scopes, and they let you look through them. It's a great day trip to do. But yeah, so a question back as well to that, the one person saying about identifying them. That's how I do it, because I can't look and see as quickly as some of these other birders. So I snap photos and then I zoom in and it's like, oh my gosh, look, oh my gosh, look. In fact, I've found 2 oyster catchers that way. It was like you could see something unique. And then when I zoomed in, it was like, oh my gosh, look at those. So yeah, pretty fun.
Thanks, Daisy. That's great.
And unless I'm mistaken, the DuPont Nature Center is the current name, I would say, for what I was calling Miss Billy and Light. Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question for Jean. different species of shorebirds come in at different times of the season. Is there any documentation anywhere on when the relative abundance of birds occur during the different stages of migration? For example, I know that leaf sandpipers tend to come in earlier than semi-palmated.
If you have a copy of the Yellow Book,
Okay,
that's a pretty good reference for showing when the numbers start to build up and then start to drop off. And I think it's available online now on the MOS website, if I'm not mistaken.
It
Yes,
is.
Marcia, okay.
Yeah, it can be downloaded from the MOS website, but digitally, eBird has bar charts, and the bar charts are good at either the state level, the county level, or a particular hotspot, and they show the exact distribution of species throughout the year. So they're really helpful to know what to expect. If you,
Jean, is the bird
I was gonna say, if you go to eBird and click on Explore, the fourth option is Explore bar charts, and it'll take you where you need to go.
that's great. Thank you.
Jean, the breeding bird atlas for Maryland, is that complete? The third one?
This is year 5 right now. So
Okay.
it's in the middle of year 5.
So I was just going with McKinsey. Is that something that do they rely on participatory inputs for that as well? For
Oh,
sighting?
yeah. Yeah, that's all being done by volunteers.
Okay, so that was another. Jillian says it would be nice to have a tutorial for how to use eBird. Okay, and we have some thumbs up on that too. So good one. All right. Any other questions for Jean at this time?
And
Thank
again,
you so much. I really feel like you accomplished your goal, because I am motivated to, look at this back of this presentation, go to the right place at the right time, and know of 2 or 3 birds I might see and actually try,
Yep.
instead of just staring at masses of birds blindly.
that was the goal, to tell
Mhm.
what species are around at what times of the year
Yeah,
and what type of habitat you go to for the different species.
right.
Yep.
So that's a big help as far as where to start.
Hey, Dan, besides the field trips that were already mentioned, Patuxent Bird Club always runs a field trip to the Delaware Bayshore over Memorial Day weekend. And they are doing that this year. So if you just check their website, it'll be on their schedule. I don't remember the exact day, but it's a day trip. You carpool down. They take you where the most birds are. They check ahead of time.
And I just wanted to add, for those who are interested in shorebirds, just so you understand the reason why these shorebirds, we mentioned the horseshoe crabs. You see, the horseshoe crab only comes out to spawn between the full moon of May and June. So that's why it's this little window to go and really see thousands of shorebirds. It's an amazing, amazing sight. I mean, actually, you see millions of birds, thousands of horseshoe crabs, and it's between the full moon of May and June is when you will see the best.
Thank you. Yeah, it's exciting. Well, everybody, thank you so much, Jean. This was amazing. I agree. You accomplished your task, because I'm ready to just get up and go outside and start looking for the birds right now, and trying my hand at it. So, but I don't know if they're in here. I'll be very successful right now. But I do feel like I have a little bit more confidence that I can go out there and not feel as stymied as I was before. Thank you all for joining us, and stay well, stay curious, stay outside, stay tuned, and I hope that we'll see you next week when we learn about fireflies in Maryland as we gear up for summer. So thank you again, Jane, and
Right.
take care, everybody.
Bye. Bye, Jean. See you
Bye,
soon.
Jan. See you in June.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, Marcia.
Thanks, Bronwyn. See you next week.
Thanks, Jean. That was great. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. I got a lot of good information. Thanks.
You're welcome.